Well, we're starting with politics today, and it's an interesting day to be doing this lecture, delivering it because it's Inauguration Day. And I've spent a lot of the day watching the ceremonies and a variety of thinking, musing over where we've been, where we are, where we're going as a country. So I just kind of interesting that today's the day that we're doing this lecture. So let's start with this. As you know, this is beginning halfway through chapter 11. So the first one, we're going to talk about our global political systems. And, every society has some form of a political system. Now, even indigenous, very small clans and band levels have people in positions of some sort of authority. The way that works, though, is very differently than it does in modern cultures or large scale cultures. People are in positions temporarily, usually. Shamans, medicine people, that's different. They're kind of there. What happens, say, in a smaller indigenous society is that people who are very good at particular things are in positions of power. There aren't, the term chief, for instance, in Native American cultures was a Western concept that was, overlaid on what was really going on. Often there were several chiefs and they were responsible for different things. So if you were really excellent at the hunt and it was time to hunt, let's be stereotypical and use Plains tribes, the buffalo, you were in charge of that because your skill and your expertise had been proven. Moving, for instance, uh, migratory, groups would have a leader that was really good at that, at organizing that type of thing. The beautiful thing, and I'll probably repeat this at the end, is indigenous people say that leaders are in a position of responsibility, not power. Wouldn't that be nice? So that's kind of the way that works on a smaller level in bands and clans. But there's some form or system of this in every society and group. So, and you could call that government. It isn't really a government in the smaller bands and clan and indigenous people, but your textbook refers to every society having some form of government, which refers to that. A formal and here's the definition of government: a formal organization that has the authority to make and enforce laws. Um, so those forms of government vary from democratic to totalitarian, from authoritarian to monarchies, and we'll go through each one of those and learn about the characteristics of those as we move through the rest of this chapter. But we're going to begin with democracy. It's a political system in which ideally citizens have control over the state and its actions. How do they have control? Well, it's not through brute force or guns or, that type of thing. It's through voting and the processes that are involved with that. So that's what makes a democracy a democracy. You can have a revolution in a democracy, and luckily and blessedly, that revolution is a nonviolent one normally because you do it at the polls. And you do it, and add in here, by the citizenry does it and does it well and effectively, and it's in its ideal form by educating themselves about the issues. Um, so, in fact, wait, I'm going back a minute. Jefferson said there can't be any democracy without an educated public. And he didn't mean school learning education, because how many people went to, college or even, primary schools in the days when Jefferson was around and speaking and thinking? He meant people who cared, who went to town hall meetings, for instance, which were where people learned about uh, politics in those days, um, and where they questioned the people that were running for political office, et cetera, et cetera. That's what he was referring to. That they cared, that they saw it not just the voting, not just as a privilege, but as a responsibility to maintain the democratic system, this great experiment that the U.S. started with. So here's how I have a better definition from another sociology textbook. I often bring in things from that text because it's so much more dense and complete and thorough and academic than the one you're using. It also costs over $200. So the better definition is a government whose authority, this is a democracy, a government whose authority comes from the people. And here is a key point. I wish we were in a classroom so I could write this up on the board for you. Demos means the people in Greek. Whenever you see the suffix, the end of a word with a ocracy at the end, spelled either O in this case or AR, think of monarchy, oligarchy, democracy, et cetera, et cetera. That suffix refers to power and authority. The prefix, the first part of the word, is whoever has that power. So in a monarchy, it's mono, a single one. It's one person, generally a king. In an oligarchy, in Greek, that prefix means just a few. So it's a few people, as in some South American, Central American countries where there's just a few, often military people who run the show. Okay, that's an oligarchy. Democracy means the people have the power. So that 60s chant, power to the people, was literal. It's a literal definition of democracy. So in a democracy, individuals participate in government decisions. They select leaders. If they participate, that's what happens. You'll see as we get to voting demographics that we have the lowest voting rate of any industrialized nation and some non-industrialized nations. There are reasons for that, which we'll go through when we get there. But it doesn't work if people don't participate, basically. Suffrage means the right to vote. So when you hear the term women's suffrage, that was women attempting to get the right to vote. It took 2 generations of women to get the right to vote when that movement first started, and that happened in 1920. So the right to vote in democracies, that's universal. That means everybody has the right to vote without manipulating, congressional districts and, a variety of other things to suppress the vote, which we'll also look at later. Technically, in a democracy, every citizen has the right to vote. And elections are frequent. They're free. There's no poll tax, which is one of the ways the South managed to keep black voters from voting for generations, was to have a poll tax. That's not a true democracy if there's some payment involved in doing it. So the elections are frequent, free, fair, and secret. That's part of the definition of a democracy. The government recognizes individual rights, which such as freedom of speech, including dissent, freedom of the press. I think it was Benjamin Franklin who said the most important institution in a democracy is a free press. And I might say an accurate press, a fact-driven press. Okay, so these are the freedoms, all right? Freedom of speech, including dissent, freedom of the press, freedom of assembly, and the right to organize political parties that compete for office. The rule of law requires everyone to obey the law and to be held accountable if they violate it. So that's another aspect of, and once again, theoretically, ideally, that means everyone. The elite are not exempt from the rule of law. Once again, ideally, in the concept of democracy, definition of democracy. So worldwide, about 35% of the world population, which is approximately 2.5 billion people then in 2014, with the addition of this text we're using, there's more people in the world now. They live in countries with repressive governments. So that's 35% of the world lives in countries with repressive governments that deny those basic political and civil and human rights that we just discussed as a definition of democracy. So those are primarily those countries that where people live in repressive governments are in sub-Saharan Africa, China, and Russia, Middle East. Those people are likely to have not the least likely to have political freedom in those parts of the world. So sub-Saharan Africa and North Africa, the Middle East, China, Russia. Okay. And democracy, and this is a scary thing, instead of democracy increasing around the world, in 2014, it decreased for the 8th consecutive year, countries that have democracy or have moved to democracy. If it's decreased, that means some of those countries have moved from democracies to authoritarian rule. So you could think about, or totalitarianism, you could think about that. And we are now moving on to totalitarianism and dictatorships as definitions. It's on the opposite continuum, opposite end of democracy. Totalitarianism is a governmental system in which the government controls everything in one's life, from macro to micro, and controls every aspect of people's lives. Here are the characteristics. First, this is interesting. Think about this in light of present situations here. A pervasive ideology. Okay. Beliefs about the way things ought to be that justify social arrangements, that legitimizes state control and instructs people how to act in their public and private lives. That's the first characteristic. The second is that there's only a single political party. There's no choice. And that's controlled by one person, a dictator, a supreme, sometimes idealized leader. If you think about Hitler, for example, he was highly idealized. There have been many other examples, but that's one that one can think of. Putin tries to be idealized. He isn't so much anymore by the people, but he still got the reins of control firmly in his hand. So this idealized leader stays in office indefinitely. Kim Jong-un is another example of that in North Korea. And then in Saudi Arabia and Syria, there are examples of totalitarian leaders who have no thought of ever leaving power as long as they're alive. So that's the second characteristic. A system of terror that relies on secret police and the military to intimidate people into conformity and punish dissenters. And the fourth is total control of the government over other institutions. That includes the military, education, the family, religion, media, cultural activities, etc. Let me go through those four, excuse me, without the descriptions again, but just the points, the characteristics. So this is totalitarianism and dictatorships. A pervasive ideology, a single political party, a system of terror, and total control by the government over all other institutions. So that's at the opposite end of democracy. In the middle are these other two, authoritarianism and monarchies. So in authoritarianism, the state controls the lives of the citizens, but it permits some degree of individual freedom. So Russia's an example of an authoritarian state. They may permit elections, but they're not free, okay? They prohibit free speech. What I mean is they're not free access elections, and they're not they're not necessarily legitimate elections in many cases. So they can permit elections, but they're usually controlled. Free speech is prohibited. In other words, you can vote for somebody, but it's going to be Vladimir Putin who's on the list or someone he handpicked. When he stepped down as president and became prime minister, he handpicked the guy who was going to be president. And the next time around, he ran as president himself again. So it punishes questioners of systems, policies, and imprisons people without trial. And then, well, here's Putin. We just talked about that. And also there's often militarism involved in this. He invaded Crimea, which is eastern Ukraine in 2014. And unfortunately, we didn't do very much about that to stop that. So that's authoritarianism. And just from the word, you can tell what kind of a system that is. It isn't totalitarianism. There's a wiggle room of freedom in things that don't really matter that much. Okay. A monarchy is where the power, and I'm sure you know this, is invested in solely on the basis of heredity, and it passes from generation to generation. Generally, there have been plenty of upheavals in history where a different hereditary line has become a monarch and gotten rid of the line, genetic line of the monarch that had been there for many years previously. But in general, it just is passed on, So that's how that works, passed from generation to generation. It is the oldest type of authoritarian regime. Now, modern monarchies are not authoritarian regimes for the most part. In Saudi Arabia, they are for sure, but not in Western countries. So it's the oldest type of authoritarian regime. The way it's legitimized is not through law, but through tradition and religion in many cases. Don't forget, Queen Elizabeth is the head of the Anglican Church in England. That's one of her, or any monarch in England, that's one of their main roles. There are more than 40 monarchies in the world, Middle East, parts of Africa. In that case, they're absolute control. In modern Western monarchies, it's a combination of constitutional law and bodies and the monarchy. So the modern monarchies in industrialized nations are Norway, Belgium, Denmark, Britain, Japan. And those monarchs don't really have, they're kind of figureheads. It's once again tradition, but they don't have a lot of political power. So that's how that works. And England is the one, of course, we're most familiar with. The monarchs have primarily ceremonial roles. So now let's look at politics, power, and authority. What is power? The ability of a person or a group to influence or carry out one's will over others, even if they resist. That's a good definition of power. For example, a government can quash a peaceful protest, or conversely, they can eliminate the law that allows people the right to protest. Now, you have to understand the difference between legitimate power and coercive or illegitimate power. This is just a crucial point, and I'll explain why in a minute. So legitimate power is having a role or position, excuse me, that people accept as legal and appropriate. So this is a key point out of that other social textbook. I want you to listen to this sentence. The more that a government's power is seen as legitimate, then the more stable the government is. Okay? The more the government is viewed as legitimate, the more stable the government actually is. So a state, for example, is a political entity that claims monopoly. Oh, this is an amazing sociological definition of the state. Think about this. A political entity that claims monopoly on the use of violence in some particular country. Bottom line, that's what the state is. The only people that can kill you with impunity are people who represent the state, whether that is in our country, the death penalty, or whether it's the military or police or whatever. They are representatives of the state. Congress in a state has a right to pass laws, and police, for example, have the right to enforce laws on those other groups that I mentioned. Now, what's coercive or illegitimate power? That relies on the force of threat or to impose their will on others. It's not seen as a legitimate way of operating. So power, this is a key point. Power is a relationship. It's relational. And it's upward and downward. So downward is, for instance, the laws that are made, the rules that are made, starting in Congress, senators and Congress people, representatives, they affect our lives because of the laws that are passed. Take taxes, for instance, takes interest on student loans, governmental loans, etc. Those so many things affect our lives. I can't go into all of the examples. Do we have universal access to health care? Those kinds of laws. I'm sure you can see how that affects people's lives, okay, directly in a downward way. So the upward way is that voters, can protest, refuse to follow laws, vote politicians out of office. There you go. That's the best way to do it. So both legitimate and coercive authority is about controlling people. And many governments depend on authority. So I want to explain to you the difference, give you a story about the difference between legitimate power and illegitimate or coercive power. Say you're either speeding, even slightly, on a city street, or you slide through a red light, a yellow just turning to red. You're supposed to always stop on a yellow, not slide through, okay? And you get a ticket, and maybe it's a couple of $100. And you don't like the fact that you got a ticket, right? And it may make you very grumpy, but you're going to generally, the vast majority of people are going to pay that ticket and acknowledge that, yeah, I was doing something I shouldn't have been doing, okay? Now, you walk out of a mini market or something, a 7-Eleven, and a mugger holds you up for whatever you got in your pocket, which is maybe $20 or $25. You are going to be pissed, excuse me. Okay? You are going to be much more upset about that $20 that the mugger got from you than you are about the $200 that you paid to the court. Because what the person who held you up, and mugging isn't a good terminology here, I guess, because that involves violence. I'm just saying somebody who, maybe held a gun to you and said, give me your money. What that person did, that thief, was using illegitimate power. They had no legal right to demand your money. And you know that, and they know that. And that really is a terrible feeling, to have somebody who has illegitimate power over you, forcing you to do something. Whereas, the policeman who stopped you when you went through the red light or whatever is a legitimate representative of legitimate power. For most of us, not for all of us, obviously. but for most of us, that's true. And so we do what we've been socialized to do. We get it. We did something wrong, and we got caught, and we'll pay the fine to the legitimate authority, which is the court in this case. So that's the difference between the two. So let's look at Max Weber here. A wonderful. Wait. There's one more thing we want to talk about here is authority before we get to Max Weber. So authority is the legitimate use of power. Okay. We look at people who have in some capacity the legitimate use of power. I have the legitimate use of power to give grades. That's part of my use of power. I have the legitimate use of power. Teachers do particularly in college where there's academic freedom, to lecture and give, I always identify it as my interpretation if I'm not, working directly from the text, but, to speak publicly with a voice of authority because of the processes that I went through in terms of education and degrees and blah, 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 to be able to do that. That's on a very micro scale. But once again, you can move this idea of what authority is to, it's the legitimate use of power, and it has three characteristics. First of all, people consent to it. That was the example of the speeding ticket in the court. So people consent to authority for the greater good, traffic laws and other laws. Two, people see the authority as legitimate. It's valid, justifiable, and necessary. Very few people enjoy paying taxes, but we know that we need to pay taxes or we wouldn't have any roads, we wouldn't have any public education, we wouldn't have a variety of other things. So that we see that as legitimate, most of us, not all of us, obviously. So that's the second one. And the third is they accept it because it's institutionalized. There are certain processes that you have to go through to be able to have that authority or speak with authority. So those are the three characteristics. People consent to it, people see the authority as legitimate, and they accept it because it's institutionalized. There's some process. You have to jump through hoops to be able to have this authority, whatever level it's at. So Max Weber, a great sociologist, said there are three ideal types. And ideal doesn't mean that they're the way they should be. It means that the way they're structured, in a sense, and they all manifest a little bit differently. Any ideal type in sociology is a concept, but it may manifest a bit differently in the real world, but it's a way to discuss, issues, put a framework around them. So the first ideal type is traditional authority. There's three, by the way: traditional, charismatic, and rational legal. And so we'll talk about all of those. The first, traditional. This is like a monarchy. The power is based on customs that justify the ruler's position. That source of power in traditional authority is personal. It is held within the person who has this inherited position through traditions and religious beliefs and a variety of other things. Traditional authority is most common in non-industrialized nations. So power resides often in kinship groups, in Africa, for instance, in the Middle East, in Asia. So you have tribes, bands, and clans, as well as kings in many cases, and in a very few queens that have authority. The second kind is charismatic authority. Charismatic authority is really pretty interesting and powerful. You think about some of the people in history that had, even just in the U.S., charismatic authority. Certainly John Kennedy, Martin Luther King, Franklin Delano Roosevelt. Some people think Ronald Reagan did. On a larger scale, Hitler, certainly we're back to him, had a kind of charisma. And what that is an exceptional individual whose abilities and characteristics inspire devotion, trust, and obedience. So we're back to Hitler with obedience and other charismatic dictator. Alexander the Great apparently was extremely charismatic. We can look back at, and Julius Caesar. We can look back at people in history as well who had a lot of charisma. So like the traditional authority, charismatic authority is very personal. It's who they are. It's their persona, what they look like, how they speak, and of course what they say as well. And it also involves sometimes extraordinary deeds. I think Martin Luther King is another example of that, someone who was very brave and took huge risks. So not only was he an incredibly charismatic speaker, he did extraordinary deeds as well. And so there's also a belief in many cases that the leader is chosen by God if it's a charismatic leader. And that inspires devotion and trust and obedience, as I just said. Now, the charismatic leader, one of the ways it differs from a traditional leader is that they don't pass on their power and authority or their role to their offspring. It's in them, and when they're gone, it's gone. Okay. Now, the third kind is rational legal authority. Now, listen to those words, rational and legal. So reason and law. So we have a rational legal system. We do not have a hereditary form, like monarchy, for instance, of leadership. We vote based on laws, right? There are laws that control everything, and that's rational legal authority. The power is based in the belief that laws and appointed or elected political leaders are legitimate. Here we get into very interesting territory in modern times. This is really the first time in America that this is where people are viewing leaders as not being legitimate, and that's a huge issue. Authority is vested, and this is an important thing to understand about rational legal authority. The authority is not vested in the individual who holds the office, whatever that office is, from mayor to president. Is vested in the office itself because there are laws that control and affect what the leader can do and what they can't do. So that the authority is vested in the office. It's not a personal thing so much, okay? Not legally, the authority is her. So it's vested in the rules, regulations that pertain to the office. And here's the key point. The rules stay the same no matter who's in the office. That's why the authority is vested in the office. The laws and rules don't suddenly change when a new mayor is elected or a new city council or a new president or whatever. The laws are the laws, and they don't change unless the lawmakers change them. Now, does that mean that a rational legal leader, authority, cannot be charismatic? No, it doesn't. I gave you examples of some in U.S. Leaders who were charismatic as well as rational leader. I guess John Kennedy being the foremost among them. He was actually someone who had an office, and the authority was vested in that office. So Lincoln is another one, as they point out in the text. I forgot about that. Abraham Lincoln was extremely charismatic, and the authority was in the office of presidency. So it was a combination of both. So charismatic leaders can bring an enormous amount of influence to an office, but the authority legally remains with the office. And then with traditional authority, there were many traditional monarchs and rulers that had charisma. So I mentioned a couple of them to you, Julius Caesar, and certainly Napoleon is another one, and Alexander the Great. There were many, Cleopatra, gosh, you could go on and on. Okay, Now we're going to look at politics and power in the United States. So let's look at political parties first. A political party is an organization that tries to influence and control government by recruiting, nominating, and electing its members to public office. And political parties provide a way for citizens to shape public policy at the local, state, and national level. And so here are the functions of political parties from a functionalist perspective: recruiting candidates, organizing elections, and then all the work that goes on to get out the vote, the phoning, the mailing, it's always volunteers who man the political offices in a city or something of that nature during elections, to answer questions and register people to vote and that type of thing. So we, as you know, have a two-party system. We are the only major industrialized nation with a two-party system. It's very uncommon. Other countries that have them are, listen to this, the Bahamas, Jamaica, Malta, and Zimbabwe. None of the large-scale industrialized, post-industrialized nations have a two-party system. They have multi-party systems. So there's 3 major parties in Canada, 5 in Germany, 9 in Italy, and more than 20 in Israel. So let me explain something to you, what the problem with majority rule is. Say there's 100 students in a classroom, and I say, all right, you have a choice between an in-class objective final, multiple choice, true and false, etc. Or you could have a take-home final, which is going to be all essay questions. So let's take a vote. And we'll do whatever the majority of the class wants us to do. Okay, so we take a vote. And 49 people want essay take-home finals, and 51 people want to be in-person true and false, multiple choice things. Who wins? Who wins? The 51 win. So one person chose for everybody, ultimately, is how that worked. And that's the issue with multiple choice. With 2 parties. That's the problem with that, is it can be, and we've seen that, extremely narrow margins. Now, if 75 people out of the 100 in class had said we want to take the test in the classroom rather than a take-home, that's different. Or 90%, or maybe even 65%. But 51 to 49 there's no options. There are no options for people other than these 2 diametrically opposed options. And so that's why other industrialized nations don't have majority rule. They have proportional representation, where those parties all have somebody who gets elected from them. And that percentage of the vote that the 3 parties in Canada, let's take, because 3 is easy, have that number of representatives in Parliament, okay? So you have a much more of an opportunity to make coalitions and to do a variety of other things to pass bills. Okay. It isn't so, split in these 2 head-butting, parties. Now, all political parties are based on ideology. Ideology or beliefs the definition of ideology is: beliefs, goals, expectations, and actions. If you look at the table 11.5 in your book, you'll see where they've listed the political parties by issue. So the issues such as the economy, abortion, gay rights, education, and you can see what the values of the Republicans and Democrats are related to all of those issues. You can also go online, and I would suggest everyone used to do this in the classroom, pull up the party platforms of the Democratic Party and the Republican Party. Now, you're going to have trouble with the Republican Party because they didn't do a platform in 2016. And you can see when you look it up what their rationale for not doing it is. But every party generally, every year that there's a presidential election, has what's called a party platform, where it lists what their issues are, what they want to accomplish and attain if they're elected. If you look up the Democratic one, what you're going to see, and also, by the way, for the Republican one, I went back to prior to the 2016 election to see what their platform was. So you can see something there. Theirs is primarily business, affects business and taxation. And the Democratic Party, as you'll see if you look it up, has to do with, you know, things like universal health care and minimum wage and, you know, that type of thing. If you do look them up, you don't need to read all the details. They're pages and pages and pages of PDF, so you get overwhelmed. But the bold headings of each sentence under which there is a page or more of explanation of how they're going to do it tells you what their basic tenets are of the platform. Or you could maybe Google that, basic tenets of the Democratic Party, basic tenets of the Republican Party. But they're right there. You don't have to guess about what they believe in. And you can see that from your table in your book as well, which is a very narrow view of certain issues. But, you know, it really drives me crazy when people tell me they're all the same. You know, students often say, well, they're all the same thing. No, they are not. They definitely are not. And they blatantly put out what it is, or I shouldn't say blatantly, they clearly put out their values and what they're going to, what their goals are in their platforms. Okay. So it wasn't until about the 1980s, or I should say until the 1980s, there were about equal percentages who identified as Republicans and Democrats in the U.S. But by 2013, there was this huge rise of people registering or saying they were independents. It rose to 46% from 30%. So in 30%, in 1991, independents were about 30%. By 2013, they were 46%, and it's even greater than that now. There's now around 22%, 2014 again, 22% Republicans, about 29% Dems. And the majority of Americans, 55% of Americans, say we do need a third party. Independents are not a third party. You're just saying I'm not affiliated with any political party when you register as an independent. There is no national independent party. Okay. So they still have, you still have to vote for either a Republican or a Democrat because there is no independent candidate, because there is no independent national political party. Okay. Also, another thing to be aware of if you're registering as an independent, and I think all those people registering, a lot of them aren't aware of this. Primaries are when you decide who the candidate is going to be prior to an election, particularly a presidential election. Okay, you vote for which of these many candidates. Remember, was it Democratic? Both of them, the Democrats and the Republicans, had tons of people running. You'd look on the stage, and every 10, they had to split up the debates into 2 different sections for each thing because there were so many candidates who wanted to be the candidate in the primaries. Well, some states have what are called open primaries, where it doesn't matter if you're registered as a Republican, a Democrat, or an independent, you can vote in the primaries for who you want to be the candidate for president out of all possible folks. But there are closed primary states. And in closed primary states, if you're not a registered Democrat or a registered Republican, you can't vote in the primaries because the only ballot you're going to get sent is the one with a slate of potential presidential candidates for whom you in the party you're registered for. So you check that out if you're registered as an independent, what state you vote in. Oregon, the political parties have an option of having either closed or open primaries. So each season you have to check and see if it's open or closed. Each time you have to vote in a primary. Okay, what are special interest groups? These are some real issues with our form of democracy. Well, it's true everywhere, but they're really huge here. So special interest groups are a group of people who seek or receive benefits or special treatment. They're usually made up of people in a similar social class, and they have similar objectives, like, do the rich want tax cuts for the rich and corporations? You betcha. Okay, so there you go. So there are thousands of them, special interest groups, anything from big agriculture, agribiz, to labor unions. And what they do is they contribute to people's campaigns, and they lobby. So campaign contributions, unfortunately in America, money is the most important factor in winning, how much money you have. That's why all those numbers about who raised so much and the competition about that is so great. So the spending doubled for all presidential and congressional candidates from $3.1 billion, which was outrageous enough in 2000, to $6.3 billion in 2014. Many countries restrict dramatically the amount of money that can be raised for political candidates. They restrict ads, and they have a much, much shorter campaign periods. In many industrialized nations, it's 6 weeks. That's it. Okay, so that makes a huge difference. So then you look at political action committees, PACs. I'm sure you've heard about those. Those are special interest groups that raise money, and then they contribute that money that they raise from individuals to elect, their candidate, the candidates they want to see elected, who will vote the way that they want them to vote as candidates. And those PACs, political action committees, have increased dramatically from 608 of them in 1974. That just sounds so ancient of days that there were only 608, because now, that was in 1974, now there's 15,700 of them. Okay, now think about this, political action committees doing everything they can to influence candidates and those that were elected to vote a certain way. So they vary too, across the board, from, unions to the wealthy and CEOs and that type of thing. Then there are lobbyists. I'm sure you've heard about them. That's someone who is hired by the special interest group, maybe a political action committee, they go visit with, legislators and try and convince them to vote the way that their PAC wants them to vote. And in 2013, they contributed $2.3 billion to candidates. Now we're going to get into who votes, who doesn't, and why. This is the sad, to me, shocking aspect of American democracy. It's not a democracy if everybody isn't participating, or the vast majority of eligible people in terms of age and citizenship aren't participating. So in 2012, 62% voted in the presidential election. These are eligible voters, and that was down from 64% in 2008. It was larger than usual, and that those were both Obama elections, and yes, they were huge in terms of turnout. The 2008 one was 2% higher than the 2012 one, but it was down still. Everybody's talking about what great voter turnout that was. Well, it was down from the 50s and the 60s in America. Of the 110 countries that hold democratic presidential elections, 69 of them have higher turnout than the United States. 69 countries who have democratic elections have higher turnout than the US. We're supposed to be the greatest democracy on earth. Okay. And in 17 countries that have democratic elections, at least 80% of the eligible voters vote. So why is the US so low? Well, there's a lot of demographic factors. Talking fast now because I only have about 10 minutes left on this flash drive here. So the demographic factors, there's lots of them, but the primary ones are sex, age, social class, race, and ethnicity. Those are the most important ones. So sex. In every presidential election since 1966, women across all of those categories, race, ethnicity, social class, etc., have voted more than men. In 2012, 64% of women voted and 60% of men. As it says here in your text, the reasons are unclear, but many of us don't think they're that unclear because women care very, very deeply about social issues and social services such as abortion rights and health care and child care and education and those types of things. So there's a perception that women have a higher stake in who's elected because of all of those things: access to health care, abortion rights, education, pay equity in jobs, that type of thing. So the biggest gender voting gap, however, is African American women. And they vote almost 9% more than Black men, which is really interesting to think about why that would be. So that's sex. Age. Across all other demographics, the older you are, the more likely you are to vote. So in 2012, it was even much higher than usual. The key factor, registration. Okay, so even young people voted more in 2012 because of the huge effort at voter registration. So the 55% of 18 to 24-year-olds are registered, but still, this was in 2012. So 55% of 18 to 24-year-olds registered. Okay, that was high at that point, but compared with 78% of those 65 and older. So young people, it's so interesting that there was a huge social movement to get it, to drop the voting age to 18, because it wasn't fair to send young men in those days. It was predominantly men off to war and not have them have the ability to vote. But it never really got taken up with the fervor that the movement to get the vote dropped to, the registration age and voting age to 18 did. So there's part of the reason that young people don't vote as much is they're more mobile. And so when you move, you have to re-register, et cetera, et cetera. There's the paperwork and that kind of thing. From research, it shows they feel uninformed about politics. And so the culmination of all of those things is that then the younger people have less effect on politics. Social class is another major demographic. I think it is age and social class are the two major ones. At each level of education, voting increases. Those with advanced degrees are the most likely to vote, and they usually are more informed because they're paying attention, and generally they're paying attention to valid news sources. And they're more interested in the process and believe that their vote counts. And I think it's because they've taken some classes that allow them to understand how the system works, or encourages them to understand it. Once you understand how the system works, you want to vote, believe me. And voting also increases with income levels. But remember, income is directly correlated positively in America with education in most countries. The higher the education you have, generally, the higher the income. So voting increases with income levels. For one thing, you have more to lose because you have property, you pay higher taxes generally, not always, etc. Often people in lower income strata are too disillusioned with the political process and to vote. Also, I put in here Maslow's hierarchy of needs. Those of you who've taken psychology classes and other social classes may know Maslow's hierarchy of needs says, at the bottom is survival. It's a strata, and at the top is self-actualization. And there's a lot of layers in between. Okay. But if you're in survival mode, are you going to, generally, you're so stressed, you're so overwhelmed, you may be depressed, you may be self-medicating, you may, all kinds of things. Are you going to sit down and really parse the political system and figure it out and that type of thing? Generally not. So that plays a lot into the whole thing. Now, race and ethnicity is really a major one too. So 2012 was the first time since African Americans were able to vote that they voted at a higher rate for a presidential election than whites. The key to voter turnout, I cannot say it enough, is registration, because you can't vote if you're not registered. So in 2012, both blacks and whites had a higher registration, 74%, than Latinos at 59% and Asian Americans at 57%. Blacks actually voted more, and that was the first Obama election. But the surge, even within that, was primarily older people over 45 years old, and especially women. We're back to gender. Attitudes is another barrier to voting. Many people have a low opinion of the government. They don't trust the government. And I have to tell you how counterproductive that is. Vote for people you trust then, But not voting because government's a mess means you're part of the problem, quite frankly. If you want to fix that or help, be a participant in that, we need more voting, better candidates, run for office, But it's very counterproductive to do the low opinion of government, don't trust government stuff. Government does a lot of really wonderful things. Okay. And then there are situational and structural factors that can encourage or discourage voting. Other countries, by the way, have compulsory voting, many of them. You're fined if you don't vote, or it's going to be difficult to get a passport or to get government benefits if you don't vote. So the message is that voting isn't a privilege, but a responsibility. And indeed, it is both. It is both a privilege to live in a democracy where you can have your input, but if you want that democracy to work, then it is a responsibility to vote. Okay. Also in other countries, elections aren't held on work days. They're held on the weekends, or election day is a holiday, so that you don't have to worry about childcare. You don't have to go to work and then somehow get to a place to vote. Also, there's more electronic voting. Oregon's wonderful because we have 100% mail voting, and many other states are doing that now. So that helps with the idea that, you have to go to and stand in line in a polling place on a day when it's a regular work day. But at any rate, they're not regular work days in other countries because they want people to vote. They're encouraging people to vote in other, like the European industrialized nations. So the US, instead of making voting easier, we attempt to make it harder, especially for people of color, as I'm sure you know. So 34 states, especially those controlled by Republican legislatures, I'm just quoting out of your book, so don't get on my case about this, passed laws to make it more difficult to vote. It's things like, and you've heard this discussion lately, I'm sure, government issued photo ID, driver's licenses or passports required, birth certificates, proof of citizenship, et cetera. And then limiting early voting, voting times and places. We saw the post office brouhaha in this most recent election, and closing polling places in primarily minority communities so that they had to travel for miles and miles and miles, et cetera. I am going to quit and not read you or talk to you about the three perspectives, or we'll run out of time here. Please read, especially the conflict theory and the idea of the power elite, and see the percentages of people that are controlling things. All right, I'll see you next week.